Hello, listeners. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast. And last week I got some sad news. Kerry Noble, former co-leader of the Covenant, the Sword and the Arm of the Lord, passed away last year. Kerry was a man whose faith was abused. He ended up in a totalistic, right-wing, destructive, militaristic Christian group based in an isolated part of America. He dedicated his later years to educating people about the destructive nature of hate and why it is so much better to live and spread love than it is to fall into hate. Kerry was unabashedly honest about his involvement in the CSA. He took accountability through handing himself into law enforcement, doing a stint in prison, and spending the rest of his life writing books and giving talks to educate the masses. His death passed quietly in the anti-cult space, and I wanted to take a minute to honour the work Kerry did in the second half of his life. And I hope that you will too. His book collection, Tabernacle of Hate, will be an everlasting legacy of the efforts Kerry made to undo some of the crimes he committed in his former years. Here is Kerry Noble.
So hi, Kerry, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today and for coming to tell us your experiences in a movement that I hadn't heard of until we got in touch with each other. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
My name is Kerry Noble. I live in Texas, just outside Fort Worth, Texas. I was in a cult back in from 1977 to 1985. So long time ago now. I'm an old man.
And this movement, I know that it had it didn't keep its original name the entire way through from the information you've sent me. But what was the name of the movement when you joined in 77?
When I first joined in 77, it was my wife and I. We had one daughter at that time. My wife was pregnant with our second child. We had some friends in this group, and in those days it was known as Zarephath Forum Community Church, which basically meant, Zarephath means purging. It's a Hebrew word, and it's where the prophet Elijah went to be fed by some ravens, so it was a time of depending upon God. Horeb was the same as Mount Sinai, but it was where the prophet again learned the still small voice of God. So our basic name meant that this was a purging place in order to learn the still small voice of God.
And you joined in 77. What age were you at the point where you joined?
I was 24, almost 25.
And so did you have kind of religious affiliations before you joined this movement, or was it your group of friends that enticed you and your wife to go along and check it out?
Well, I had religious affiliations before. I'd gone to church ever since I was a kid here in Texas, grew up in the church, Baptist church. At the age of 19, I was called into the ministry. A year later, I was licensed by Southern Baptist Church and was going to Bible school at the time when we went to visit our friends. Our friends had moved there a year before from Dallas, where we were, to be a part of that ministry over there. So when we went to visit them, have the baby, take some vacation time, and then I was trying to go back. And my wife and I were both in school. We were going to finish school. Still had another year to go, and then just see what God wanted us to do. But we ended up really falling in love with the place and decided to just go ahead and move on up.
And when you arrived there, what were your kind of first impressions? What did the place look like? How many people were there?
Well, it was kind of funny because it was in northern Arkansas, pretty close to the Missouri border. Very, very rural. And it took me, I think it was like 8 miles of really rocky road to get to where the community was at that point. I had an old station wagon, so it was a little bumpy, a little rough. And when we got there, it was in an old deer resort. So there was about 7 or 8 homes in a circle. So you drive around them. Then there was a main house, and then in between the circle drive of all the houses, there was like a picnic area and that kind of stuff. But when we first drove in, it looked like an old covered wagon scene that was preparing to have a war with Indians, or something like that. It was kind of, all the cabins were white on the outside, so it was kind of funny. But once we started on the rocky road, we came across a huge herd of deer, which was the first time my wife and I had ever seen deer.
Wow.
Wild turkeys. It was the first time to see wild turkeys. And there was lakes in the area. So it was just very serene and tranquil, other than the bumpy road itself. And of course, my wife was pretty much 9 months pregnant, so I had to go kind of slow. And you know how that feeling is.
Yeah.
So we got there, and it was just really kind of this kind of community feel, because of how the cabins were laid out, So we got there. Our friends were waiting for us when we got there. And, of course, it's been a year since we'd seen them. So, it was nice reunion time. In those days, there was only about 8 couples is what it was. So we were all about the same age. The leader of the group was he's 12 years older than I am. So he started the group about 3 or 4 years before this. They were out cutting timber. That's what they did. And the vision for everybody was to raise our children in a Christian environment, working together, fellowshipping together, and living on the same property. So we wanted that community feel. Most everybody had come out of the major cities, or some of them from churches, but not too many from regular churches, other than the leader of the group was Jim Ellison. He and I were the main ones that had been raised in the church. My friend, the couple that we moved up there with, they had actually come out of a cult called Children of God.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay? So they had come out a year before I met them. So they, talked a lot about their experiences. They got out when it started getting bad at Children of God. A lot of the sexual stuff that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So just them sharing with me some of the experiences that they have really put a hunger in me for community. Of course, didn't want to go as extreme as Children of God did. We didn't want to either. And that couple had 2 children. My wife and I, like I said, had 1 child, and we lived together in the same house for a year before they ended up moving up there. So that year together in a 2-story house gave me sort of my first taste of community. And we never had any issues. We fellowshiped together. The guy and me worked in the same place. So we worked together, provided, from paying the bills. Women did their stuff. So it was just what I was really looking for. And so when we moved to Missouri, it just seemed like heaven on earth to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It definitely has that kind of utopian, picturesque feel about it when you describe it, kind of being away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and the busyness of it, and having sort of like living off the land and having a small community of people. It sounds really tranquil when you describe it that way. And the big house that you mentioned, is that where Jim Ellison lived, the leader? He had the...
Actually, no. He was in one of the smaller cabins.
Okay.
He had a small RV parked next to it. My friends were actually the ones who lived in the main cabin.
Okay.
But they moved, I think it was about 4 months after I arrived, they ended up moving away.
Okay.
My wife and I ended up moving into the main service.
Oh, so you got the big house, the nice big house.
Yeah, so we got the big house. My friends ended up, they moved to another location to oversee a ranch for the guy that the group was cutting timber off of 5,000 acres. So our friends ended up moving over there to kind of ramrod the ranch because the owner lived in Pittsburgh. So, he wasn't there. So that, allowed my wife and I to move into the main house, which wasn't, huge compared to the cabins, but, maybe 50% bigger, not a lot bigger.
Yeah. And as people joined, did you build more cabins, or were they like kind of mobile homes that people could bring along?
Well, originally, this was called Mountain Creek Resort. Okay. That wasn't our property. The owner of that had shut down the deer lease part of it years before. It just wanted somebody to live on there for free, just to make sure somebody didn't come along and destroy the place, So it was just a temporary place until the paperwork went through for the property that Jim wanted to buy, which was, a mile and a half from us.
Okay.
224 acres. Once that purchase went through, which was early 78, then we started clearing land, building houses there. It had one old house on it, original house. But of course, everybody wanted their own houses. So then we started building. And as houses were getting built, people would move from Mountain Creek over to the Zarephath Horror community.
And how were these properties funded? Was it still kind of you going out and working and bringing back money to kind of buy supplies?
Yeah, we had agreed. When I first moved up there, the men were getting paid $100 a week for cutting timber.
Okay.
But then we agreed that, if we're going to, pull together and build homes for each other and be a community, then that $100 ought to let's just have a common pot.
Right.
That we could fund that, and the money would help everybody, with their basic needs and that kind of stuff. But the community would pay for the building of the homes, the power, electricity, all that kind of stuff.
Wow. Yeah. So did you have to put in like all your own irrigation and everything as well?
Yeah. Here's the thing: we had what we called settlements. We had 3 settlements. So you had the main settlement, all sort of in the center. And then on the other 2 ends, you had the basic settlements. Now, the basic settlements had no running water, no electricity, no insulation in the houses. Mine was the first house to get built in what we call the outlining settlements. Because my wife and I really wanted to get back to sort of the basics. Part of the foundation of the group that the reason Jim started it to begin with, it was an apocalyptic group. He believed, that Christ was coming soon, second coming, end times, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between what Jim taught and what the typical churches teach, and you've probably heard this from some of the other interviews that you've done, is most Christians believe that during this tribulation period, they would be raptured out off the earth ahead of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have God's judgment on the earth for 7 years or whatever people have. Jim did not believe we would end the rapture. He believed Christians would have to go through the tribulation as part of the purifying process.
Right.
So he wanted to prepare a refuge for people to be able to come to when all this happens. And in those days, we didn't know what would happen. There was all kinds of scenarios of what could happen: economic collapse, war with Russia, nuclear war. Who knew? We didn't know. We really didn't concentrate on that too much, and we weren't setting dates for anything. We just believed at some point down the road it would happen. And so in the meantime, we would prepare for it and save, store up clothes and food and build housing to prepare for people. So the vision was apocalyptic from the start, but because we did it as a community, and I was the Bible teacher for the group once I moved up there, I just taught all the Bible stuff and made sure everybody was spiritually prepared, and we just cut timber for a living. So the first 15 months was really like heaven on earth. I mean, community to me was the apex of everything that I had experienced. And it was just a delight to be there. But, things change.
Yes. And we wouldn't be talking today if those changes didn't happen. So
that's right.
So it was, you moved from Mountain Creek Resort. Was there a name for this new kind of settlement that Jim Ellison had purchased?
The new one was Zarephath Horror Community Church.
Right. Okay. So the entire acreage, that was the name.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
224 acres. The informal name at Mountain Creek was just Zarephath. But
Right.
once we got our own property, then that sort of expanded it. So we expanded the name also. For people moving in was from a Christian point of view. Most of them didn't care about end time kind of stuff. They were like us when we first moved there. They wanted to raise their children in a country environment, Christian environment, get away from the cities, live together, work together, fellowship together. So, for quite a while, that was, that was the standard for us. You had to be following Jesus. We allowed no smoking, no drinking at all, no drugs, obviously. A clean lifestyle. So the standard wasn't real high, but there was a standard there before you could actually move onto the property.
And did that come with things like dressing modestly and making sure that you were kind of respectful in terms of the doctrine around sex outside of marriage and things like that?
It did, not so much as a rule. It was sort of a natural thing for us. The women just sort of naturally wore longer dresses. They weren't required to have long sleeves, anything like that. But,
right.
Most of the women they did dress modestly. The men, when I first moved there, men had beards. It was agreed later on to shave the beards, cut our hair short. I had long hair when I first moved there. Because long hair represented our rebellious days before moving there, the hippie days. And all that.
Yeah.
So just as a symbol for being more committed, we agreed to shave the beards and cut the hair short, sort of a not buzzed necessarily, just short.
Right. Okay.
And
when Jim Ellison decided to start this movement, was he a part of another church or another movement, and his values didn't kind of match, so he moved somewhere where he could have those beliefs and practices?
Jim grew up in what's called the Disciples of Christ Church. I don't know if you have that in England, but it's fairly popular here. It's not one of the main denominations. Kind of a pretty strict conservative church.
Okay.
He was going to Bible college, when he was a young man, and when he became a senior at the college, he had a spiritual experience where he believed that he saw God as a whirl of bright lights at the base of his bed while he was laying down, and it changed him. It's what in the Christian circles would be known as the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And, he spoke in tongues. He had, so everything changed. That caused where he was a ruckus at college because the college did not believe in the gifts of the Spirit or the baptism of the Spirit. And he became pretty outspoken about his experience. So he ended up actually getting kicked out of school.
Right.
That was in Illinois. He moved from there down to Texas, San Antonio, and joined a church that was called the School of the Ministries. And he started, the charismatic church, charismatic movement. And there he learned more about, the gifts of the Spirit, that kind of stuff, but also more about the end time teachings. They were very strong on end time teachings. There came a point where he believed more strongly about Christ coming back than the other elders of the church did. They ended up kind of having a split. And that's when he left and took his family to Missouri. 3 or 4 other families in that church joined him.
Right.
By the time I got there, those other families had left, and his original wife had left also. They got tired of waiting.
Okay. So that brings us then to where you are with your kind of utopian life that you've found here in this community. It must be great as well to be raising children in such an environment that you feel is peaceful and has such wonderful values. And what did education look like for the children on the commune?
Originally, Jim's children were the oldest. Obviously, he was older, so they were in public school when first went there. After we got our own property and grew to a certain size, I think it was in 78, maybe 79, we decided to pull them out of school. Some of our children were getting old enough for school and just have our own private school. So we taught our own. And of course, you had your basic math, reading, writing, history, that kind of thing. Not so much on sciences. To be honest, Jim wasn't big on education.
Okay.
I was, some of the other people were, and I wasn't going to allow my children to not be educated to some degree. I wanted them to read, write, know how to do math, at least the basics of education. So, he said, okay, so we just started doing that. And I think there were, I taught high school kids when they got old enough. And I think we had 3 other women that taught also.
Okay. So by this point, kind of 78 to 79, how many people are actually living on the property at this point, roughly?
By mid 78, there was I think we grew from 8 families to about 15 families.
Okay, so we're picking up some numbers and some traction. And at what point does the vision or the ideals of the group start to change, and the kind of the peaceful community starts to morph into something a little less utopian?
That happened in August of 78.
Okay.
That was the first shift. And what happened, we had a newsletter we gotten from a guy up in the northeastern part of the United States that talked about what's called the 9th of Ab in the Hebrew calendar. And he predicted a lot of chaos in August. We didn't hold a lot of stock in it, to be honest, but we thought, well, who knows? This guy's supposed to be a prophet and all that kind of thing. We kind of started putting back a little bit more food and that kind of thing. Well, just in case something's going to happen, I wanted to go down to Dallas and see my parents for the last time, theoretically, if something did happen, right? While I was down there, I visited some friends that we had gone to Bible school with, and they gave me a cassette tape by a man named John Todd, who had just come through the area talking about some conspiracy theory kind of stuff.
Right.
What Todd, he used terminology that we had never heard about: the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, the Council of 13, Council of Foreign Relations, those kinds of things. Stuff that meant nothing to us at the time. But he was naming names, and he was talking about how major politicians, major movie stars, rock stars, even Christian preachers were involved in witchcraft and were part of the conspiracy to form this one world, one religion government that we've perceived of as part of the end times, right? So, I took the cassette tape back with me to our group, and we listened to it. The elders did. And one thing that Todd said, some of the conspiracy stuff was interesting, but the thing that he said was there are people building refuges in the United States to protect people when all this happens, with the coming out, which was, of course, he was talking about like ours. He said, you're putting back food and you're building some homes, you're putting up clothing. But have you considered what's going to happen when bad people come out also and want what you have? So we had never thought about that. We just sort of always assumed that God would just protect us somehow. That didn't really even care about details. But Todd said you need guns. Just like Israel had to learn how to fight in the Old Testament, swords, that kind of stuff to protect against the enemies. You need to protect yourself against the enemies. Well, that made sense, So we bought guns. At that point, only one guy in all of our group had a gun, and it was a single shot 22. That was it. Nobody else even owned a gun. So for the next 18 months, we spent $52,000 on guns and military equipment. We got serious.
Wow. Oh my goodness. From just like 0 to 100 then.
Yeah. I mean, and that was in 78 to 1980. So that was a lot of money back then.
Wow.
$1,000 is a lot of money now, but it was really a lot of money back then.
How did you manage that? I mean, what were the laws like back then in terms of firearms? Was it easier to obtain things then, or did you kind of each go individually and sign your name to a firearm?
Here you can buy guns everywhere, anywhere. So we'd go to gun shows and buy guns primarily. In those days, there wasn't too much of a background check done. We'd only had the Gun Control Act of 1968 was now only 10 years old. So there wasn't that much gun control in this country.
Right. Okay.
If you were buying a gun from a gun shop owner, you filled out a form. I don't even think there was a waiting period in those days. But if you bought guns from people at gun shows, you didn't have to even fill out a form. You just bought them.
Okay.
So we bought rifles, shotguns, pistols. Then, of course, if you're going to buy them, you got to know how to use them. So we built a shooting range. We built an obstacle course, and we built a 4-block mock town called Silhouette City so that we could practice every scenario we could imagine.
Wow. Okay.
Sundays became our military day. Wednesday nights became military teaching night, where we learned, various field craft with military. And on our military day, we just shot. And we'd go camping out anytime that it was bad weather. If it snowed, if it rained, we'd go out hiking, we'd go out camping, just like you would if you was in the military, and having to fight the military.
Wow. So it was very serious, taken very seriously.
And we got big enough, we were growing now even more. We got big enough to start forming squads. So we have like 4 different squads. Each of them had a specific purpose. And had a little bit of rank in there. So it got very serious. We had ended up by spring of 19, I'd say by fall of 1980, we were known as the #1 civilian SWAT team in the United States.
Oh my goodness! And
in those days, it was
teaching everybody were you getting kind of outsiders come in and teach you how to use all these firearms?
No, actually, the one guy who had the single shot 22 originally, he had been raised in here. He had been raised to hunt. And here's the thing. The reason he had a single shot 22 is because his dad taught him if you can't kill something on the first shot, you don't need anything.
Right.
So he learned how to kill a rabbit or a deer or whatever one shot. So he was a good shot. And
wow,
this was stuff that had interested him all his life. So he had military manuals that he had absorbed since he was before his teenage years. Even. So he taught. We bought more manuals. He studied, just like I was the Bible teacher teaching the Bible stuff. He was the military person teaching the military stuff. So, we grew. Honestly, obviously this was for defense. There was no offense to talk about. Most of us had never been around guns, used guns, all that much before. But it gave us a sense of security. Because if it did get bad and people didn't want to take what we had, now we were able to protect ourselves.
And where were all of these weapons kept?
Every man had to have a rifle and a pistol. So our rifles and pistols were kept at our house. If you wanted a shotgun also, you were issued a shotgun to keep at your house Some of the women wanted pistols, so they could have pistols on. Other than those, the rest of the armament, we had a building that they were stored in. Because we made our own bullets also.
Wow.
So that our little munition building housed, the rest of the weapons it was used to make bullets with, that kind of stuff.
So you had a full kitted armory on the property?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
We have well over 200 weapons.
So we've kind of talked about 78 to 1980 and the progression of this. And before we move on to the next year, you talked about there being different squads and each squad having a different purpose. What was your specific squad that you were a part of?
I was home guard. I was in charge of home guard because going out and fighting was honestly not my thing. If it came down, everybody had to do guard duty at night. And when it came down from my shift at night, every horror movie I'd ever seen as a kid popped into my head. I expected, monsters to come out from behind the corners and that kind of thing. So I wasn't that much into the paramilitary part. I liked the fact that I felt safer with the weapon. And obviously, if I'm going to have a gun, I need to know how to use it. But dressing up in military gear and going out on maneuvers, that kind of stuff, that really wasn't my cup of tea. But I had to do it because we all had to do it. We all moved as one unit, so I had to do it. So, Jim had me just be in charge of home guard. And plus, there were some guys who just weren't able to go off the property. We had, as an example, we had a man who had an amputated leg right below.
Okay.
That would have been difficult for him to have gone out.
Yeah.
So he was part of home guard. We had a couple of guys who were mentally challenged a little bit.
Okay.
So it was better for them to be part of home guard. So home guard was I think there was 6 or 7, maybe 8 of us all together. It just didn't fit the criteria for going offensive if we needed it.
And does this 78 to 80 period coincide with when men are starting to shave their hair shorter and get rid of their facial hair as well?
Well, yeah, we started doing that before the paramilitary.
Right.
Once we got into the paramilitary, of course, then that really fit in too. And part of it, when you're out cutting timber, we cut cedar. And in the summertime, cedar, you get a lot of sap. Well, if you got long hair, you got a beard, you're going to get sap.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So for practical purposes, it was easier to shave, have short hair, because it was easier to clean up anyway. So when the paramilitary part came in, that just fit in anyway. And obviously, if you got long hair, you got a beard, and you're in a fight, that's a disadvantage for you because somebody can pull your hair, pull your beard, and guide you. So, with the paramilitary part, we realized that short hair was an advantage for us.
Okay. And I'm just intrigued now because I'm starting to get visions of uniform and the property having kind of traps set up or some kind of alarm system so that if anybody's coming onto the property that you're not expecting.
We were building, like I said, we had 3 centers. And in those 3 centers, we were building bunkers so that if people were coming in, you could not only have to defend from your house, you could run to a bunker, defend from there. We had, later on down the road, we had landmines planted around the main. So that if a huge group of people were coming in, we had I think it was 12 landmines that we could set off.
Oh my goodness.
We got serious.
And a landmine is something you can just purchase from a gun show?
No, that you got to build.
Right, okay. Oh my goodness, building landmines.
One of the military manuals we bought was on how to do that.
Oh,
so we, some of the men who are more inclined to that, not me, some of the other guys put those together, buried them. We have wires going to a communication building. We had a detonation box where you put the switch and it would blow up that particular landmine.
That is wild.
Now here's the funny story. we had a storm. I think it was in, I don't know, 80, 81 or something. We had a really bad electrical storm one night, and lightning must have hit close to those landmines because every single one of them went off at the same time.
Oh my goodness. I'd start thinking because that was the rapture. I'd be like, this is it. This is it.
So it woke everybody up, of course. And we had these huge holes out, across the property where the landmines were. And we looked at it and went, maybe this wasn't a good idea. So we never replaced them at all, because then we got to realize, of course, what if this had been in the daytime and the kids were out there playing,
Not just that, though, but you're all talking about being out and about and camping in the adverse weather. And then you get some crazy electrical storm where any of you could have been out on the property at that point. Oh my goodness, that's terrifying.
I could have been doing guard duty in that area at that time, or blowing somebody up. I mean, it was just one of those freak things that we just hadn't even thought about the possibility of. So once that happened, we just said, no, let's not do this again.
Yeah. Good. Oh my goodness, that's a really.
We weren't always stupid, but sometimes we learned the lesson,
So, what was the next turning point with the group as it kind of carried on this journey?
Okay, two things happened in the fall of '79.
Okay.
First thing, Jim wanted to make more money for the group, and he was an iron worker by trade. And the government was building missile silos up in Missouri. And as a welder and iron worker, he could go up there and work and make really good money. He could make more money by himself than we were making in that week. So he was doing that. And he made plans to only come home 1, maybe 2 weekends out of the month. The rest of the time he would just be up there working. So he was making money. Once a month or maybe twice, he'd bring some money down for me to put in the bank, as I had the finances also. So one thing that happened during this time period, he met a man named Dan Gaiman in Missouri who had a church called the Church of Israel. And one day, Jim brought home a cassette tape from Dan's church service, and he had all the elders gathered together, and he played the cassette for us. And they started out in their music service playing patriotic songs rather than regular church songs. America's Beautiful, My Country 'Tis Thee, that kind of stuff. And there was some traditional hymns. And then Gaiman started talking about Christian identity, which is the racist religion of the extreme right. And then this was brand new for us, obviously. So Gaiman taught that the Jews were not God's chosen people in the scriptures, the white race was. And he brought out some scriptures, that kind of stuff. And of course, Jim and I being raised in the churches, this was 180 degrees for us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this wasn't as easy to grab hold onto as the guns was. It didn't fall into place right off the bat. But Jim was intrigued by it. And what it sort of did for us initially, because, we're a survivalist group, and then we become paramilitary based upon John Todd's recommendations, and the stuff that John Todd talked about seemed to be what or how we would have a one world, one religion government because of these secret societies throughout the world. And then here comes Gaiman, which seemed to build upon that platform even more, but now focusing more on the Jewish control of these organizations.
Okay, yeah.
Jewish control, okay?
So kind of more conspiracy theories coming through.
Yeah. And of course, Gaiman brought out some scriptures that Jim and I were familiar with the scriptures, but he did them in a different point of view. What was interesting for us, I could remember, I was a teenager in the United States when the race riots were going on in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I could remember one Sunday talking in my Sunday school class, asking my teacher, so what does the Bible say about different races? Because I didn't know. I mean, we weren't taught that kind of stuff. And my teacher says, that's one thing we don't talk about in the Southern Baptist Church, is what the Bible talks about races. okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was a taboo subject. I never knew what we taught as a Baptist about why there are different races, that kind of stuff. The only thing you sort of heard was, Ham was cursed, one of Noah's sons, and somehow became black. And never really explained that when I was a kid, but that's sort of the idea I got. So here's a group of people with Dave Gaiman who not only were willing to talk about race in the scriptures, but wanted to talk about race. That made an influence on us because I'm the Bible teacher. I want to know if it's in the scriptures. I want to know what it's talking about, right? But it took us about 6 months to sort through that. I bought a bunch of books, read everything, because everything had to come through me first to go out to the people. And then, Jim and I would study it together. So it took us about 6 months before we accepted the theology of Christianity. Not completely, because part of it, are you familiar with Christian identity?
No, I'm not personally, no.
So what Christian identity teaches basically is you have Adam and Eve in the garden, and you got the serpent.
Mm-hmm.
The serpent they call Nakash. That's the Hebrew word for the serpent. They teach was the devil, Satan, who the temptation of Eve was that the serpent, Nakash, which was an angelic creature, seduced Eve, had sex with her.
Mm-hmm.
She goes and has sex after that with Adam, and she conceives twins. Dad, who becomes Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, right? So they teach that from the out of the garden down, there's been this warfare between the seed of the devil and the seed of Adam. That's why they call it the seed, okay, the seed line. And then, of course, after Cain killed Abel, then Adam and Eve had Seth, and that warfare continues. And they say it continues throughout the day for the control of the earth. So that's why it focused more on this seed from the devil, which then eventually they say became known as the Jews. But the other races, they teach that like the black race or Asian races were created before Adam, and that they have symbolic names in the scriptures.
Right.
So you start looking at those things. So once you kind of sort through, which is a complicated theology, but if you can sort through it, then it starts to sort of make sense. Again, because it's the first time people have brought up these kinds of scriptures and sort of how to look at them from a different point of view. So, that changed. By spring of 1980, we had done, accepted that. The other thing that happened in 79 while Jim was gone, some of the men started making illegal weapons, turning our legal weapons into fully automatic machine guns, which is illegal, building silencers, hand grenades, that kind of thing.
Right.
Their philosophy while Jim was gone was, and these were some of the leaders of the paramilitary part, was that if these hordes of people come in, we need more powerful weapons to shoot at, with. Machine guns, if a gun a mob coming, a machine gun would be more effective than, having to pull the trigger every time.
Mm-hmm.
When Jim came back after Missouri was done, he wasn't happy with that.
No, okay.
He didn't like the fact that we had illegal weapons. But our paramilitary leader, the guy that trained us, explained it to Jim and made it sound good enough to Jim. Jim said, okay, makes sense. We'll keep them, but they're not ever to leave the property. We need to make the government mad at us. And of course, if you're going to have those things, some of the men wanted to practice with them. So we started shooting some of the machine guns. We practiced with the hand grenades, that kind of stuff, which of course some of the neighbors could hear.
Yes.
started complaining about it. So it, but that was a huge move for us. So by the spring of 1980, we're a survivalist, paramilitary, racist organization that has illegal weapons. So we are extremists by this point.
are these values and the weaponry classes and all of those things, are they being taught to the children and the young adults of the group as well?
Women were not allowed to shoot automatic weapons. We had a concern over that. The boys never learned how to shoot guns until they were 12. They had to be 12 first.
Okay.
Once they turned 12, then they could shoot, start off with the 22 and start shooting those. Nothing automatic. Kids, obviously, and the women, obviously, would handle the hand grenades.
Okay, yeah.
And for the most part, most of the men never handled the hand grenades. The only time we did it was in our Silhouette City. We would do a scenario of if you're driving through town and you need to take out, say, a police car, but that, cops may be the enemy by that point. We didn't know. And we would practice driving up to a parked car, throwing a hand grenade in, driving off.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
So we would do that. It was intense, training. We dug trenches. We get down the trenches, and the guys would shoot over our heads with live ammunition so that you could wire what it sounded like when a bullet went by. The training school, we had people from all across the country came and trained on our property. In fact, it was kind of ironic. The only accident we had during the training school for Silhouette City was we had a Houston police officer that came down and trained with us. And who was a little cocky. The leader of the group said, you need to calm down, notch it down a little bit. And he said, look, I know what I'm doing. I'm trained and all that kind of stuff. Pulled his gun out of his holster real fast to kind of show off and ended up accidentally shooting himself in the foot.
No. Oh.
So the only accident we had was from a cop that didn't even live on the property, I talked to him years later. We laughed about it. I was on a radio program. He called in and said, remember me? I said, oh, yeah, I remember you.
No way. Oh, my goodness. Of all the things, when he's told to calm down and he's like, no, I don't need to, and then literally shoots himself in the foot.
It's himself in the foot. We did have a couple of accidents later on that I can explain later on, but in the early days during the training, that was really which was remarkable.
Yeah, that sounds like a miracle in itself.
Yeah.
Then in 81, at some point between the spring of 1980 and 1981, there's a name change to the movement itself.
We, of course, we're getting more, just growing more, getting more people coming. We were, by this point, 150 people, 32 families, and half dozen single people. We had been going to some of the different other right-wing groups to visit them. Some of them would come down and visit us. And one of the groups we went to was called the Christian Patriots Defense League up in Illinois. Came real friendly with them. And they had a conference every January, and they wanted us to be the security for them in January of 81. Well, ABC News was there during the conference.
Yeah.
Interviewing people, about the survivalist movement, because that was a big thing in those days, of course. And they interviewed Jim. So, and then it was on television that night. So when we came back after that conference, Jim gathered us all together and said, look, we need a name that is going to be our public name. Because when you say Zarephath Horror Community Church, everybody goes, huh? You got to explain all that, right?
But the Christian Patriots Defense League sounds a bit different.
It sounds different. So, the church name was a sacred thing for us. So we said, okay, let's try to come up with a name that would be our public name. Jim came up with CSA, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. So we had a military patch that had a flaming sword on it and a rainbow over it. So was all the covenants God made from Adam all the way through Christ, and, Christians. Sword was the flaming sword, which goes back to the Garden of Eden when man was kicked out of the garden. And, the arm of the Lord is who we believe would disperse the judgments of God upon the earth. So it pointed towards judgment. more than the church needed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we started calling ourselves at that point. So the church became sort of like the mother of CSA. It was separate. We never did away with the church name, but it was just for us. But the public name became CSA, and basically that's what everybody knew us as in those days.
Right, okay. And the patches, were they sewn onto like loads of items of clothing, or was there a uniform established?
Yeah, we're all more military fatigues. We all had military outfit, the camouflage and that stuff. So it was part of the military gear that we had.
Okay.
So the patch was on our uniforms. A picture of the logo was on all the material that we published. And, it became our symbol. Just like, if you think of the swastika as the symbol for the Nazis, this was our symbol that everybody knew this was CSA. This was for nobody else. And most of the guys, having been from the South, liked that Jim came up with CSA because of the Confederate States of America, the Civil War stuff. So it kind of had a heritage thing for guys who came from the South as well.
I can't, this is so different to everything I've ever heard. This experience that you've had is so...
We were different.
Yeah, it's so different that I can't even predict where this is heading now that you've talked about building trenches and landmines and building your own grenades and having army fatigues and changing your entire doctrine to something, that's...
Here's another part of it. Because the religious part, again, the spiritual part is extremely important to us. So when we learn Christian identity also practices, this is kind of ironic in a certain sense, they practice the three feasts of Israel, Passover, Pentecost, or first fruits, and the Feast of Tabernacles that the Jews celebrated. Passover, if you know anything about it, was when they killed the lamb, sacrificed the lamb, and to reflective of the blood of Christ being shed on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the other groups just took Passover as, they had communion during Passover. We took it a step further because we always took everything a step further. And we would literally slice the neck of a lamb or a goat, like it said in the scriptures, take the blood, put it on the doorpost like they did in Egypt in those days, Israel out. We all sleep in the same house together. The first time that we did, we actually were hoping for a second time for God's, death angel to come through and kill the firstborn of everybody in the country that wasn't in a house covered with blood. We literally would not have been surprised had that happened. Of course, it didn't happen. We were disappointed. But every year we practiced the feast as literal as possible. So for us, this was real. This was 24/7 for us, which helped. That made us even more different than everybody else, because most groups don't live together. When you're talking extremism, they'll get together on weekends, or they'll have their monthly conferences or yearly conferences. Very, very few groups live on the same property.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's what made us more of a cult down the road than say a militia group or a neo-Nazi group, or skinhead group, and that kind of, or even Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose as well, as time goes on and your numbers grow and you're all living together, you're kind of, even though your ideas around the theology that you're teaching and the militaristic side of it is becoming more and more severe, you're all there to bolster each other in a self-sealing system where your beliefs kind of can grow together. So there's no outside influence. So when somebody comes up with something that might seem more and more wild, actually in that group, if everybody accepts it, then it's accepted, and that's how you kind of go.
Yeah, obviously those days there was no internet, and we had quit getting newspapers, magazines, that kind of stuff. So we had we had television to a little degree, but we weren't keeping up with what was going on in the world as a whole. I mean, nothing like you do now, right? So the only material, once we got into the extremist movement, the only material we got in was from other groups. So, that just added fire or gasoline to the fire, because that, the old computer thing of garbage in, garbage out, we just had to be more and more garbage. I'm also, in 1981, we started publishing a journal, a newsletter.
Right, okay.
Journal. That was, you fold it over, say, well, all that kind of stuff. And we had 2,000 people on our mailing list. So every month, all of us who had any kind of a position would write articles. So the guy that was in charge of our paramilitary would write a field crafts article. I'd write some spiritual articles. Whoever else wanted to contribute would put that in there too, right? Get a little bit of some factual, quote unquote, stuff from other groups would put in. So for 81, after we came on to the CSA, and through 82, that was pretty much where we were. We were just putting up the newsletter and doing stuff and communicating with other groups. And then I approached Jim with, we've got all these groups across the country. It would be nice if we could all unify somehow with a national leader. And wouldn't it be great, Jim, if you were that leader? Right. So he liked that.
Oh, okay.
So he said, yeah, that's a great idea. The other groups would come down and see CSA, meet us, we can meet them, that kind of stuff. So we invited the Klan, the neo-Nazis, the militia people,
oh, God.
all these people, right? And we had in October of 1982, we had our first, what we call convocation. We had 300 people from across the country, and all these other leaders got to speak. It was a week-long conference. Put them through the survival school, we put them through training, shooting, whatever these guys wanted to do.
Oh, my goodness.
It was the introduction to us, right? So then, towards the end of that week, we gathered all the leaders together and said, look, this is what we would like to do. Rather than have splintered groups, let's form one coalition together. And yeah. And then everybody, of course, says, well, we want our leader to be the leader. No, it's not. Our leader wants to be the leader. That's our idea, right? Well, of course, nobody wanted to do that. Everybody wanted their own leader to be the leader, and every leader wanted to be.
Yep.
So obviously, the national coalition thing did not appear.
I really wonder what it would look like now if it did happen, because I feel like that's how new religious movements start. They branch off, like how you mentioned how Jim's vision at the start didn't quite match what other people were saying. So could they kind of split off from each other and started their own things? So Jim's got his thing going now, and that's probably what these other groups have done that you're trying to create this kind of national coalition with. And I feel like when I read about the Seventh-day Adventists and movements like that and the Branch Davidians, that's how these groups have come to be as they are. And the Seventh-day Adventists is a huge movement now. And so it's quite scary to think about what would have happened if that would have stuck, especially with the ideals and the military side of it. I don't know, that's quite a scary thing.
But, it's so easy for groups to split, but it's almost impossible to gather them together.
Right.
Because once you split, you become autonomous. Once you're autonomous, you don't want to be controlled anymore.
No, of course. Right.
So it's we just never thought that it would be that difficult to do. But after, of course, everybody said, no, thank you. Then we realized that's difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in this country, it's like having 50 governors, governor from each state trying to agree together. It's very difficult.
Yeah, and probably never going to happen.
probably not going to happen. So, we realized that was a futile thing to do. We just never brought it up again. But here's the next step that happens. Right before the convocation, one of our elders, we didn't know this ahead of time, but one of our elders had committed adultery with one of Jim's daughters.
Oh, dear. Okay.
Yeah. And after the convocation was over, he called an elders meeting and wanted to confess in front of the elders. By that point, Jim knew about it.
Okay.
She was not happy with it, obviously. She was 14.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
He's one of the elders, so, for whatever reason, he ended up sleeping with this girl several times. And he said, this is something, I'm sorry it happened, but this is something I can't live with here. I'm going to move. And he wasn't going to take his wife and his kids with him. They were going to stay on the property because basically, they were done as far as he was concerned.
Right.
He was leaving in shame, right? So, this was a shock to us. This was something we never imagined would have happened in our group, right? Because our kids were protected. Our kids, this was supposed to be a safe environment for our children.
Yeah.
No pedophiles should be coming in, no drugs, that kind of stuff. But to have one of the elders.
I suppose you don't think about that at the time as well when you're so kind of focused on protecting yourself from the outside. You don't think about
the inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he confessed it was agreed that he was going to leave. Well, he hadn't been gone 2 weeks. And then Jim gathers the elders together and says that God has told him to take this guy's wife as Jim's second wife.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Now, polygamy was first discussed in our group in 1978. I'd have brought it up because I saw some scriptures that kind of pointed to it. And we agreed as a group not to get into polygamy. It was taboo to even talk about it.
Right.
For 78. So here comes Jim 4 years later and says, God told me to do it. Well, that caused a huge split in the group. The paramilitary leader said, absolutely no, because, we agreed to this 4 years ago. We were not going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim said, pretty much I've got no choice. I have to do it. And the paramilitary leader said, if you do it, we're leaving. You're going to cause the destruction of CSA. Well, he ended up doing it. And we lost 2/3 of our members, which, interestingly enough, the ones who left were the paramilitary people. So from my point of view, because I want us to go back to just the spiritual aspect of what we're doing. I'm picturing this as an opportunity for us to go back to just being spiritual and not the paramilitary.
Yeah.
Not being involved with hate groups and that kind of thing. So I'm backing Jim on this. I'm the only elder that does. So we have the split by February 1983. Everybody that was going to leave immediately has gone. Jim takes this woman as his second wife, so we have polygamy on the property. About that, shortly before that, just after that time period, another couple moved onto the property this guy had 2 wives.
Okay.
From another group. So once Jim did it, that sort of opened the doors. And then this other guy came in with his 2 wives.
Okay.
And now we've got two polygamous families in there. This is in 83. Now, I start in March of 1983, I'm starting to change because what happened for me, I'm doing a Bible study on Matthew 24, which is, the primary chapter when you're talking about the end times and that into the last days. So I'm preparing to talk about, more signs of the last days. And I will try not to get too theological on this, but basically there's a verse that says that except those days be shortened, even the very elect might be deceived. I'd read that scripture hundreds of times before, but all of a sudden it hit me. How can the elect be deceived during the end times. That didn't make sense all of a sudden. And I began to look at it from the point of view of the only thing that you're deceived by is something that looks like the real thing.
Yep.
You can't be deceived by a $3 bill because there's no such thing as a $3 bill.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to kind of lay it out in steps. How would the last days deceive the elect, which we considered ourselves part of that elect, if the last days looked like the Antichrist, the opposite to the kingdom of God? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I theorized that maybe it doesn't look like the opposite. Maybe it's supposed to look like the original. Then it brought in the parable of the wheat and tares that Jesus talked about, where you can't tell the difference until the time of the harvest.
Yep.
Wheat has fruit, the tares don't, right? And so I just started putting it all together, and I became convinced that the last days, this one world, one religion government, if it even happened, would not be an antichrist situation of anti-Christians and all that kind of stuff. It would look like the kingdom of God as opposed to being opposite to the kingdom of God.
Okay.
That was revolutionary for me, right? Because what that meant for me was that I had always been taught, Jim had been taught too, most churches teach it, that man is basically evil and sinful. And were it not for the grace of God, would manifest the works of the devil, works of the flesh. I began to see it as the opposite, that man is created good and divine, and were it not for the weakness of the flesh, would manifest the kingdom of God. So my understanding of just the nature of man changed as well. So instead of seeing the end times as the worst that man can do, I began to see it as the best that man can do.
Okay.
Short of what God can do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody that I had ever read before taught this. I'd never heard of this from anything.
Mm-hmm.
This was just, for me, this was a revelation.
Yep.
I'm through this Bible study. So I present this to Jim, who, of course, threw a cow. No, I don't see it. I don't agree with him. No. He wouldn't even listen to our argument.
Yeah.
He said, but I kept persisting, and he said, so what do you think we're supposed to be doing? I said, well, look at what I think God is doing. God has split the group up. We've lost our paramilitary people. We've lost that part of our identity in this thing. We're not really connected with these other racist groups. We don't have anything really in common with neo-Nazis or skinheads or the Klan. That's not really who we are.
Yeah.
We start here as spiritual people. Let's go back to that. And rather than being a curse to our neighbors, let's be a blessing to our neighbors. We got people here who have all kinds of talents. We could open up businesses in town that would flourish our group and bless people on the outside. I said, I think that's a better mission for us.
Yep.
Well, he didn't like it, but he said, okay. And we had been involved with the health food thing for several years by this point. So we agreed we'd open up a health food store in town. And it could become a source of revenue for us. We'd be able to get our health food stuff cheaper. So, there'd be some benefits to it. So we opened up a health food store in a Walmart shopping center in northern Arkansas. And it did quite well. But if Jim just never went along with it. So after the year leaves, we shut it down. That's with him.
That just doesn't make any sense to me. How can a man who says that he's had visions from God or has seen God or believes that he is supposed to take a second wife not believe you when you come to him and say, I think we should be doing better things for the community?
Yeah. And I'm the Bible teacher. It's not like I'm one of the flockies kind of thing. Here's the thing. To do that, and I didn't get this at that time, obviously. Later on down the road, I finally could get this. And what it really got down to, if Jim had agreed with me and done this, he would have had to have admitted that his original vision was wrong.
Right.
And if you're a leader, honestly, by this point in time, once I was able to look back, I knew that by this point in time, we were a destructive cult.
Mm-hmm.
We were doing what Jim wanted to do. That was the allegiance. We didn't question the authority and all that kind of stuff.
I suppose that's why 2/3 of the group actually left as well, because when he went against what everybody else's wishes and went and took a second wife anyway, then where does it stop at that point? If people are unhappy with the way things are going and it's no longer a democracy, it's obviously more of a dictatorship. If he's like, no, it's what I want to do, so I'm going to go and do it. Where does it stop then? Where does he go poaching other people's wives, or you just don't know at that point, I guess?
You don't know, because honestly, the split even really wasn't over the polygamy. That was the issue.
Mm-hmm.
The root of the split was the purpose of the elders were check and balance against Jim, so that if Jim was doing something the elders didn't agree with, we would talk about it.
Right.
Previous to the polygamy thing, if Jim had an idea and we, as a group, the elders said no, he'd go, okay, and he wouldn't do it.
Right.
So this is the first time Jim says, I don't care if the elders don't agree with me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do this anyway. So then what's the purpose of the elders? Now there's no check and balance, which is what you're saying. So what could he do next?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That was really what it got down to. But here's the other thing. When we had our first convocation with all these racist groups coming in, we also met a man who was from Oklahoma, and we had a group in Oklahoma. That was a spiritually minded group. It was the first group that we had met that was pretty close to what we were doing in the early days.
Okay. And
he was part of a countrywide ministering group of men all of which had their own roots across the country. They were known as the Otter Creek Ministries, because every year they got together and met at Otter Creek. Jim really envied these guys because they would come in as a group, and it was like a brainstorming think tank on spiritual matters. Here's what God's doing in the heavens and all that kind of stuff, right? But here's the thing. Once Jim met them, every single one of them had more than one wife. So in order to fit in with that group,
mm-hmm.
Jim had to have more than one wife. So if it looks like CSA is falling apart, he's wanting to align more with Otter Creek theology, which most of them believed a variation of Christian identity to one way or another. They just weren't neo-Nazis or Klan or that kind of stuff. But that opened the door for him taking another wife, which of course comes from the elder taking Jim's daughter to bed.
Mm-hmm.
So probably from Jim's point of view, he saw that as God, that all this thing kind of fell into pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So he took this woman. So for 83, first part of 83, once he took this woman to be his wife, then I got the revelation of Matthew 24. I opened up the health food store.
Yep.
Things really seemed to be going back to the original days. We weren't doing military practices because we had no military leader.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of stuff quit. So it looked, from my point of view, that, okay, good. This is over with. We can go back to being normal to some degree or another. Well, June of 1983, there was this catch protester had a shootout with some marshals up in North Dakota, killed 2 marshals. Didn't mean anything to us. We heard about it on the news, but really meant nothing to us. But he fled, and I think it was 2 months, a month or two later, maybe 2 months, he was discovered in Arkansas, not too far from us.
Right.
Had a shootout with the FBI, and his name was Gordon Call. And he had a shootout with the FBI, and the local sheriff got killed, and Call got killed. So this was seen as the first time that the government really came against what the right-wing movement considered a hero in those days. Because this man was a decorated Korean soldier Korean War soldier, big in the tax protesting movement.
Right.
Killed. So this became our first martyr in the movement in those days. So since he was killed in Arkansas, then everybody said to us, "What are you going to do about it? This is your backyard. This is your territory," because everybody's got territories. Well, that puts us in position. Do we do something in retribution against this to save face with the movement? Or do we say, no, thank you, and we'll never be in good graces with the movement again? So in July, it was decided that Jim would go up to area nations in the northwest of the country, Idaho, and find out what everybody else thinks should be done. And comes back and says everybody's agreed that it's time for war with the government.